This is the podcast for women who want to create careers and lives they love. I'm your host, Heather Fincher. Welcome to the Powerful Professional Women podcast. If you want to create a career and life you love, then you're in the right place. I'm an attorney practicing tax law in Washington, D.C., and I started this podcast because I'm on a quest to learn everything I can from successful professional women, and I want to share that journey with you. I want you to be empowered, informed, and inspired by the women on this podcast, because I want us all to win. And every woman's path to success is her own. So take what works for you and set aside the rest. I'm thrilled to have DeDe Halfhill on the podcast today in front of a live audience to tell her story and provide actionable insights on leadership. DeDe is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel and an internationally sought-after keynote speaker and executive coach. Described by Dr. Brené Brown as one of her leadership heroes and a total badass, DeDe's 25 years of military experience leading and advising in high-stress environments makes her uniquely qualified to share practical leadership strategies. Drawing insights from her service in pivotal roles as a commander during 2 deployments in Iraq, as a senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as a lead spokesperson implementing the Department of Defense's global communications strategy, DeDe inspires organizations with her candid approach to vulnerable, authentic leadership. DeDe, thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, Heather. I'm super excited to be here. I can tell already the energy is going to be amazing.
Yes, so glad you're here. So you have been recognized, by 60 Minutes and Brené Brown's New York Times bestseller, Dare to Lead. You're a certified Dare to Lead facilitator and an executive coach. So I understand you started following Brené's work in 2010. Where were you at that point in your career?
It was such a serendipitous moment. I was actually leading a squadron in Iraq. I was doing everything. It was my first real big leadership opportunity where I was going to be in charge of an organization. And in Iraq, you can imagine, there's a lot on the line with that. And so in preparation for that, I was doing everything I could to figure out, who do I want to be as a leader? How do I want to show up? And candidly, it wasn't going well. And that's when I saw Brené's TED Talk on the power of vulnerability. And given I saw that TED Talk in that moment, a light switch just shifted for me.
Wow, DeDe. Okay, being in Iraq, there must have been significant leadership challenges. What's a story that stands out for you that illustrates leading with vulnerability, compassion, empathy in that context?
It's a great question. When I was in Iraq, and like I said, I was trying so hard to show up as the leader I wanted to be, the leader I had envisioned for so long. They prepare you in the Air Force for these big moments. Squadron Command is this pinnacle that they tell us, that's who you want to be. That's what you want to achieve. So it's something I had been building in my mind for, 10, 12, 13, 14 years, a long time. And I get there and I'm stumbling and it doesn't feel right. And it doesn't feel like I'm showing up the way I had envisioned I would. And then I saw Brené's TED Talk, and this idea of vulnerability just hit me like a ton of bricks, because it gave me a language for what I was feeling myself. It gave me a language for what I was seeing around me. It gave me a way to articulate something that was going on inside that I didn't know how to articulate. But once I could name it, once I could see it, then I could actually do something about it. And what ended up happening was, it was a very mundane moment. I was at the gym. I was lifting weights. I was just in one of those states when you're kind of in your own head and you're telling yourself, you're not that great. You suck. You're a horrible leader. You're the worst thing that's ever happened to our Air Force. I'm like, that negative self-talk can be so powerful. And it was just going so loudly in my head. And I went back to at the time we called them CHOOS, containerized housing units, basically a little metal box, right? But I go back to my room in my little metal box, and I'm really just kind of having my own moment. I'm not doing well. I'm crying. This is so much harder than I thought it would be. And I called up a friend of mine, and I was upset on the phone. And to calm me, he says, DeDe, all of us feel like this. All of us feel like failures at some point in our career. Like if you're not doing it right, like if you're doing it right, you'll feel like a failure. If you don't feel like a failure, you're not doing it right. And I was like, it just kind of hit me. And I thought, why does no one talk about this? Why does no one prepare us for the fact that if you step up to lead in very challenging ways, in challenging spaces, you're not always going to get it right. And you are going to feel like you've failed or you not the greatest thing to have shown up, right? And having that conversation along with what I was learning through Brené's TED Talk and then subsequent digging into whatever I could find of her work, I realized so much of that pressure I was putting on myself. I wasn't giving myself any self-compassion. I wasn't leaning into self-trust. I wasn't looking back on all those times I did well, all those times I was successful. I was solely focused on this one time and space where I wasn't as successful as I wanted to be. I wasn't giving myself the compassion for the fact that this is new and I'm learning and I'm trying and I'm growing. But more than anything, I thought all the ways in which I am showing up poorly are really just me protecting from anyone else knowing that I feel this way. So I wasn't asking for help. I wasn't leaning on the mentorship of others. I was in an environment where I was the only female in my organization. I was the youngest commander in my group. And I was the only commander who hadn't led. I didn't grow up in the squadron I was leading. And I was the only commander who, this was my first time command. All my peers were in their second command. And so I wasn't giving myself, compassion for the fact that for me, this was completely new, yet I was measuring myself against their ability when they were in their second command. They grew up in the squadron commanding. They're at least 4 to 5 years older than me. So that's 4 to 5 years of experience. And they have each other. I'm kind of an odd person out, being the only female. So it really kind of shifted everything for me. I mean, it was literally a moment. I can still feel the moment where I thought, I might not be good at this. And if I'm not good at this, then what matters? And the only thing that mattered to me in that moment was to go back to my squadron. And while I might not be a great commander, what I could do is I could make everyone know and feel that what they were doing there was not in vain. That my focus shifted from me and it shifted into how do I make them not feel like I'm feeling? And I didn't know it at the time, but what I was leaning into was vulnerability, right? I was accepting that reality that maybe I'm not the best commander the Air Force has ever seen. Turns out that's not true. None of us are the best commander. Like we're all struggling and we're all trying. But I really shifted it off of, I have to protect what people think of me. And I shifted into a space of, how do I help them think of themselves in a better way? And so it was a moment where I realized, wow, everything she is sharing, I need to learn, and I need to learn what it looks like to apply it. And it changed who I was as a leader. It set me on a completely different journey. It sent me into the coaching space. It sent me into a constant wanting to grow and learn. So I'm grateful for the moment. It was a really hard moment, but I was grateful. I'm grateful for it now.
So many amazing messages in that. One thing I'm going to ask is, for anyone who's not watched the Brené Brown, that video you're talking about, or familiar and they're not unfamiliar with her work, can you give us a little snapshot or just a summary of what really impacted you, particularly in that moment?
Yeah. So Dr. Brené Brown, she's a social science researcher, and she's got one of the top watched TED Talks on TED. And it's called The Power of Vulnerability. And it's an amazing TED Talk because she talks about what this word vulnerability really is and how it's not really something we can protect ourselves from. It's something we are navigating all day, every day. And we either learn to navigate it in a way that is healthy and productive, or we fight against it, and that results in ineffective and unproductive behavior. Her second TED Talk which isn't watched as much, but I think an even more important TED Talk is her TED Talk on shame. And shame is a word we don't like to talk about. It's a feeling we don't like to admit. It also is a feeling that all of us experience. But shame is this emotion that makes us feel so isolated, and it takes us away from connection. But when we can name it, when we can identify it, we can actually rewrite the stories that cause us to feel it. And honestly, while vulnerability and understanding of it helped me in my leadership journey, nothing helped me as much as understanding what drives my shame. How does it show up for me? How do I show up in it? And how do I rewrite that story? That was a game changer, but it's a topic people don't want to talk about. But I think it's the topic that we need to be talking about as leaders. If I could for just a second, I'll kind of give your audience a real quick 101 on vulnerability. But vulnerability is anytime we feel risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And I often ask my groups when I'm either out doing corporate work or even in my keynotes, tell me a day when you come to work and you are assessing or accepting no risk. Like never. In today's environment, the fast business environment, we are accepting risk all day, every day. And then I say, tell me a day when you come to work and you have absolute certainty for what's going to happen. We know after the last couple of years, like there's no way. And then I ask people, do you care about the organization? Do you care about the people you work with? Sometimes I joke around and say, do you care about the paycheck? If you care, you are emotionally exposed. So vulnerability is anytime we feel risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And from what I just shared, that's all day, every day. So we either learn to get comfortable with the vocabulary and how to navigate it, or it is driving us in ways we are unconsciously aware of.
So looking back at that experience inside of this context of vulnerability and shame and what you just shared. So in your conversation with your friend, you discovered you were vulnerable around, oh, I may not be the best here. And you started to see that like what you were feeling inside of that connection because someone else said, you're not alone, basically.
Yeah.
And then what's fascinating to me though is how did you, and then maybe I don't know if there was shame, you didn't talk about your experience of shame, or I didn't hear it. Mm-hmm, but how did you make the switch from that place to, I'm going to give to my squadron, I'm going to give to these people?
Yeah, I think, I've never really stopped and thought about it so specifically, but I think what made me shift was I knew how lonely it felt to feel like I was not succeeding, or I knew how lonely it felt to feel like I wasn't a part of something that mattered. And I just had enough care and compassion for, I think, humans. And I'm a task person, so that even sounds somewhat odd coming out of my mouth sometimes, because people who know me would say she's definitely a checklist leader, like I like to get things done. But I just watched these young airmen, and they were away from home, and we were experiencing things that were hard, and we were witnessing things that were really hard. And I just watched them and I thought, I may be in pain, but I don't want them to be in pain. I don't want them to hurt the way I'm hurting right now because I'm feeling like I'm incompetent or I'm a failure. And I just made it my mission. Like, I don't want them to feel that way. And I can't tell you why I decided to make that shift, other than I've always believed that when we are in our worst spots, by giving back, we pull ourselves out of it. Right. And maybe that was at the core of it. And I want them to feel differently than I feel.
And so something that I'm seeing in addition to that is it's it's about you as a leader. Like you're just, it's ingrained in you to be in this, you were in this tough place yourself. You could have gotten completely self-consumed and gone even deeper into self-doubt and all the rest of it. But instead, you're like, how can I give and lead this team so that they don't feel this way, or that if they are, we can connect around that. Like that just seems, what I'm seeing in you is that act is just true leadership.
It's interesting because I'm listening to you say that, and the thought that comes to mind for me is, prior to that, I thought leading was all about getting the job done. And we weren't always getting the job done, which is why I was feeling inadequate. We were making mistakes on things. To be fair, I look back now and I'm like, so many of the things that we were asked to do were kind of impossible to do anyway. And they were really, really irrelevant to what it was we were supposed to be doing there. But because of silly things that would take me an hour to go into, like putting the right colors on food choices. We had one thing where we had to do like red, yellow, green on the food choices in the dining facility. And someone put green on Cheese Whiz, and we all know Cheese Whiz is not a healthy choice, right? So these colors were there to indicate level of healthiness. And so it was little things like that we were messing up. Like we labeled the Cheese Whiz wrong, or I was also responsible for the fitness centers, and we didn't have the kettlebells in the right place at the right time with the weight facing the right direction. Like people got so caught up in crazy things, and it was our inability to stay ahead of those silly things at the time that made me feel like a failure. And so I was so focused on, are we getting the job done, that I forgot the people. And I think it was my acceptance of the failure of, we're not getting the job done to the degree to which this person believes we should be, that I then said, I don't know why that's the standard they're setting. I have to believe that there's a reason for it. So I want to support it. But what really matters to me is not, did we label the Cheese Whiz correctly? What really matters to me is the people. And I think it was probably the first time in my career where I made that distinction. Like, we may not be getting the job done perfectly, and I need to let that go and focus on how are we taking care of people. And by better taking care of them, maybe we'll label the Cheese Whiz correctly.
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm even saying that out loud. Like,
I love it.
To be fair, this was 2010. So this is a long time ago. And I hear it now with more time and maturity. And I'm like, I really kind of lost my mind over mislabeling of Cheese Whiz.
Right. And we all have those moments, though, as we're learning and growing. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that.
It is a great it's a great, I think it's a really important thing, though, to pause and reflect on, because as leaders, sometimes we do get caught up in really little things that 10 years from now will not matter. Here we are, those 2010, so almost 14 years ago. Did the Cheese Whiz and labeling the Cheese Whiz correctly matter? No, but it was the thing my boss was writing me about. Why do you not have the Cheese Whiz labeled red versus green? And at the time, I put so much importance on this silly little thing because I was still working on my own self-trust. I put importance on what he said I should be doing versus trusting myself enough as a leader to put importance on what I believe we should be doing. And so I got so caught up in the Cheese Whiz because I didn't listen to myself. And once I made that shift to listen to myself, then what became important was making the people that I was entrusted to lead feel valued. So really, when I think about it, and I've never really talked about this before, Cheese Whiz moment, when I think about it, it was a lack of self-trust. And self-trust is what we really need to be cultivating as leaders. Like, if we're going to be the ones out front, if we're going to be the ones taking risks, if we're going to be the ones shaping vision, we need to trust ourselves way, way more, and so much sooner if we're going to expect anybody else to trust us.
Tell us more about self-trust. Can you give another example? Can you talk about how you developed that in yourself?
Self-trust came to me a little bit later in life, at least the awareness of it. The more, there's so many stories I could share. I was talking to a 4-star one day, and there was an article in the World Economic Forum 2014, and it was called The Power of Doubt. Power of Doubt. And it was talking about how as leaders, do we acknowledge the doubt we feel and what happens when we do or when we don't? It kind of put it into a quad chart on what happens when you have a healthy relationship with doubt and what happens when you don't, which I think is another word for vulnerability, right? Like when you have a healthy relationship with doubt, you're also comfortable with vulnerability. But I didn't know that. I didn't really put those two together at the time. But anyway, I was talking to this 4-star and I said, tell me about doubt and sending men and women into battle. This was the height of Iraq and Afghanistan. And he said, I have no doubt. I experience no doubt. And I was like, no doubt? You experience no doubt whatsoever? And that didn't sit right with me. Like, I was really uncomfortable with that. So I went to another 4-star I know. I was very lucky. I worked with a lot of really amazing senior leaders because of my job in the military. So I had access and exposure to these leaders. And I went to this other 4-star I know, and I said, I was talking to this 4-star, and he said he experiences no doubt. What are your thoughts? And he said, I don't think it's that we experience no doubt. I think it's that we have different tools in our toolkit. And that because of the experience we've collected tools along the way. And that experience has given us and taught us new tools. And so my toolkit is bigger than yours. And he said, and because of that toolkit, I trust my decisions more. And that for me really started this journey of what does self-trust look like? Self-trust comes from trying, practicing, stumbling, trying again, getting it right, trying again, doing it better. And you just build this kind of trust in yourself in different areas. When I'm in doing work with corporate teams, have you ever seen the clip by Snoop Dogg where he's getting his star on the Walk of Fame? And he's like, I want to thank me. Have you seen it? No, it's a great clip. It's like 30 seconds. You need to Google it on YouTube. Cuss warning. He says, he swears at the end, but just be prepared for that. But he was kind of doing it in jest. But what he was saying is like, I want to thank me for always showing up. I want to thank me for putting in the hard work on the weekends. I want to thank me for making the right decisions. And what he's really doing is acknowledging where he showed up. And I show that clip in my work with corporate teams. And then I ask them, where do you need to thank yourself for showing up? And I can't tell you the number of people who I have had have an emotional response to that exercise because they realize how little we thank ourselves. They realize how little we acknowledge when we did really well. We really acknowledge when we screwed up. I can tell you that moment in my trailer when I knew I was the worst commander in the Air Force. I can tell you exactly. I know to this day how that felt. I don't know that I could stop and tell you the moments in Iraq when I did really well. I don't remember them because I didn't stop long enough to acknowledge them. Self-trust comes when we give both an opportunity to shape us. We reflect on the moments we didn't do well. We sit with them so we can learn. But self-trust is also really reliant and dependent on the moments we did well and reflecting on those as well. Like, what am I doing? Where are my strengths coming out? What am I naturally good at? What do where did I really try and show, like I tried something new and I showed up. Self-trust it's so important to do that as well. And when you have self-trust, I think it just gives you a level of just quiet confidence because no matter what, you will be able to figure it out.
Right.
Marie Forleo says everything is figure outable, right? I might be saying her name wrong, but that's self-trust when you go, everything is figure outable. I know I have the tools and I've practiced and I can do this.
Yes. Yes. And it takes being vulnerable with ourselves, back to that concept, being vulnerable, looking at where are we experiencing shame and weakness or areas of potential growth, as well as expanding it and growing stronger and stronger. But it takes the self-trust, vulnerability, and really combining it all.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a journey.
No.
Even today I'm practicing growing self-trust in different areas. Starting a new, this is a new space for me, being out in the keynote and the leadership development as far as working with, corporations. I could go into the military organizations. I know them like the back of my hand. But I have to trust that while it's different, it's the same. It's different because it's a different environment. It's the same because we're all humans. And so I have to remind myself, I know humans. I know what it's like to be a human leading in a hard moment. Trust that.
Yes, you do.
Trust that. Right? I have to remind myself of that. Just like everybody, trust it. And you have to just remind yourself.
Yes. Yes. As we wrap up this first part, DeDe, is there anything else that you'd like to share that could just about leadership with other professional women out there?
I think it goes back to something I just mentioned briefly, like we're all in this together and it really is a practice. None of us ever reach this pinnacle of I am the best leader the world has ever known. No, we are all growing and learning and practicing. And as the world shifts around us, so does our need to grow and learn and practice. Like it's going to be never ending. So don't beat yourself up if you think you're not there. None of us are there.
And we're in it together. Back to the focus that I've seen you online is really about connections, leading inside of connections authentically. So beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, DeDe, for sharing your stories and experience and insights with us. I also want to thank our live audience who have been with DeDe and me today for all of your support and positive energy. And I'm grateful to each one of our listeners. I hope you leave this episode inspired and empowered to be your most powerful professional self.